Our speakers here, and we can get on with the program. I know we have some folks online. Welcome to our webcast attendees. Thank you, and welcome to our Environmental Law Committee lunch today, which is to discuss the redevelopment of the Worcester Telegram and Gazette site. And we have two great speakers here today with us. I have some information on our folks here. We have Roberta Bryan, who is the Vice President of Projects at the Worcester Business Development Commission. And Roberta has 18 years of experience in real estate and project management. Before joining the WBDC in 2004, Roberta was recently employed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where she was a project manager for DCAMP, their Office of Real Estate. Her portfolio consisted of planning for the reuse and development of large state hospital properties, as well as the sale and leasing of smaller properties throughout the Commonwealth to private citizens and businesses. Ms. Bryan's portfolio consistently represented an annual revenue stream of $1 million in real estate transactions for the Commonwealth. Prior to that, Ms. Bryan was a commercial real estate agent and a site selector for national retail chains, where she researched and negotiated development opportunities for her clients. So Ms. Bryan has some interesting perspective, both from a private and public perspective, to bring, and we're interested in hearing her perspective today. And also with us is David Foss, who is an LSP at Wilcox and Barton. David's focus has been on remediation and redevelopment of petroleum contaminated and hazardous waste sites, and he particularly enjoys revitalizing urban neighborhoods and the social benefits of economic redevelopment in those neighborhoods. He's concentrated on underutilized brownfield sites. He has over 21 years of experience. Hard to believe he would have that much experience. He looks so young. And is an expert in brownfield incentive programs, brownfield policy, and hydrogeology. He identifies and implements solutions for projects involving difficult regulatory and technical issues, and has worked with municipalities, developers, property owners, planning agencies, and regulators to develop properties with challenging environmental histories and overlapping regulatory programs, which is very often very interesting issue in these sites. He leads the Brownfield redevelopment practice at Wilcox and Barton, connecting a broad range of public and private development interests. And he's a certified professional geologist and a Massachusetts LSP. Welcome to you both, and please, we're interested in hearing what you have to tell us today.
Thank you, Julie. So welcome to the folks who are here in person and to the folks who are listening online. And I've been told that if you have questions online, put them into the little chat box and we'll be able to see those later. As Julie said, I'm a licensed site professional, and my background has really been focusing on brownfields redevelopment. And there's lots of parties who care about brownfields redevelopment, and from the legal perspective, you want to see how many different parties you can get to a table and help take some old, I'll say blighted property. Blight really has very little to do with the building we're talking about today, but take an old blighted property and turn that around so that the new developer, the future user of the property, sees a benefit, but also so the community sees it a benefit. The reason we're talking about brownfields is that they often are kind of a hole in the middle of a city, and I'll say city generically for municipalities. But it's often a property that has a redevelop, or they're slow to redevelop, and the most important part of that is that there's a perceived environmental problem. It doesn't mean that there's actually contamination. There's an obstacle to redevelopment, and part of that obstacle to redevelopment is the perception of contamination. Now, perception could be because there really is. There's a significant release and a plume of solvents, and that really has to be addressed to protect your future user. But often you'll be looking at a large industrial property, an old mill, an old industrial facility, and although there may be contamination here and there, the perception of contamination is really delaying the redevelopment of the property as a whole. Today we're talking about the Worcester Telegram and Gazette building in downtown Worcester, and the image that's up on the slide right now shows an aerial of basically the downtown Worcester. The red roof building in the upper center portion of the photograph is Worcester City Hall. There's a plaza right behind that, just to the east. North is up in this image. The Worcester Telegram and Gazette building is the white roof that is roughly Z-shaped in the middle of that city block. And the Worcester Telegram and Gazette facility was the home of the local newspaper for the most of the 20th century, and it occupied 3 buildings that were not necessarily constructed at the same, well, they weren't constructed at the same time, but they were merged in a way that creates some real obstacles to redevelopment. So you could necessarily, enter the building from Franklin Street, which is the street closest to the city hall, and walk through a series of hallways, and then you'd get to a fire door, and when you're then going into the next building that would have been on Myrtle Street off to the back, which is the southern end of the property here, the buildings weren't actually at the same level. And so you would go up 3 or 4 stairs into a different building, even though it's all interconnected. That multi-generation of construction had there were some different uses in the history, and when we were doing environmental due diligence to evaluate this property, it was really looking at all the histories of the 3 different facilities. And one other interesting thing for a building that is absolutely in the middle of downtown Worcester, and the reason I highlight the Hanover Theater is the Worcester Business Development Corporation, the WBDC, has also done a tremendously beautiful job renovating that facility, and it's a gem in Worcester. But it just shows that the location of this building is in a prime location in Worcester, walking distance to all the amenities that you would want, very close to a lot of businesses. The city library is a block and a half away. It's a great location, so it was a great opportunity for redevelopment. And the Telegram and Gazette, which had been purchased by Boston Globe, which then got purchased by New York Times Company, they had moved most of their operations and all of their printing out of Worcester. So they're in Millbury, Mass. And so this building was increasingly vacant. There were still, some reporter staff, some office staff, administration in this building, but for a building that had this set of bones in the city of Worcester, it was really underutilized. One thing I wanted to highlight is that in the middle of downtown Worcester, this was truly an industrial operation. So they were doing the actual printing in this building. There were industrial scale printers. And so you have all the things that go with that. You have a machine shop so you can repair parts and make tools. You have a wood shop so you can build the framing, the carpentry that you need to do all your industrial work. So for a building that looked like an office building just on the downtown city block, it had a lot of industrial uses, which involved the storage of chemicals and the use of dyes and inks. There also was historically a radio station on one of the upper stories, and a side effect of that was that there was some crazy good insulation in how that portion of the building was built, which had asbestos in it. And so, you think a radio station doesn't necessarily raise a red flag. Like doing an environmental assessment, radio station does not equal, REC, recognized environmental condition, because it wasn't related to releases to the environment. But from a redevelopment perspective, a significant asbestos component kind of came into play. And then right underneath, behind the Hanover Theater, there's a parking lot underneath where the label says Hanover Theater in the slide. That parking lot on Myrtle Street belonged to the T&G building and was a former location of a gas station. And so in the world of complex history, this building that occupies a portion of a city block had a pretty complex history. There were a really wide range of environmental issues. So I mentioned that there was asbestos to be dealt with. And I'm going to talk about all these issues. Some of them are in the building materials, right? So asbestos in the insulation associated with building materials, that's really a renovation and redevelopment challenge. Same thing with PCBs in building materials. This project knew there was going to be a wholesale renovation of the building. So if you're looking at an old facility and you don't plan to remove all the windows and you don't plan to do that scale of change to the facility, you may not go and look for PCBs in caulking. That's not necessarily a requirement. But if you know you're going to remove those windows and you know they're going to be part of the waste stream of a renovation project, then you really need to know. If you're going out to bid, you want to have confidence that you know whether that's going to be an issue that drives a cost for your waste stream. So there are PCBs in building materials, asbestos, in a bunch of different materials, but really peaking in the radio station insulation. One thing that was unique to a printing facility is in the space where they took the little typeset and laid that out to actually kind of create the mechanical roll that would then go to make the printing on the newspapers. So all the little typeset is lead. Like, it's just lead. It's the soft material, right? And so those typesetting facilities, that room, which I'm going to estimate was 4,000 square feet, good size space, everything in there was built on a floor that looked like a parquet floor, except there's like 4 to 6 inch thick blocks. Like, it kind of gave a really good insulation for, kind of took away the vibration. All of that flooring was hazardous for lead because you had 50 plus years of just the handling of raw lead in this facility. And so something that's an unusual waste stream was a substantial tonnage of wooden flooring material that had to go off as RCRA classified lead waste.
Those pieces of type are called PI.
Correct.
PI.
Yep.
In Pie Alley. First time I heard PI described as a hazardous waste.
Interesting. So for people who couldn't hear that online, the nickname of the word for the type set is PI. P-I. Pie Alley's right down the road.
Right. To our office.
Gotcha.
And we know that, isn't it?
Another thing that was unique to this facility was the use of inks. And in the printing room, which was a roughly 3-story space, you have these concrete walls and floors that were clearly just not the right color gray for concrete. They'd just been stained with inks and dyes for 50 years. And part of the renovation and redevelopment cost was the cleaning of that, like making that space habitable and safe. And so just kind of the scarifying of the walls and the sealing of that material with epoxies had to be part of the planning for redevelopment. There was also historic petroleum storage beneath a couple of the different buildings and in Allen Court. And Allen Court actually is an L-shaped little alleyway that goes under a portion of the building. And so when we were trying to do drilling in Allen Court, we actually drilled through a roadway, like you feel like you're at surface grade on a surface road, through a 15-foot basement. So we actually lowered our drill rods down and then had to do penetrations down through the basement floor. So it's kind of a complex facility that has an alleyway cutting through it and the 3 connected buildings. And lastly, I wanted to mention that there's a petroleum and soil issue over on Myrtle Street. So all these things were identified during the Phase 1 due diligence, and then on behalf of the Worcester Business Development Group, we conducted the Phase 2 site assessment, the sampling. It turns out that the contamination in the ground was, I'll say, an insignificant cost relative to the contamination in the building materials. So there were things that needed to be resolved, but they were able to be closed out in the MCP program fairly simply, without making the in-ground contamination very complex. But and I guess what I want to say is that anyone doing their brownfields redevelopment projects, the things that I highlight on this slide are things that a good LSP or a good environmental consultant can help you with, and they all have an engineering solution. So I could go into a lot of detail on how we solved each one of those, but it really doesn't matter how we solved it here. It's just to say that these become little obstacles that then when someone's trying to do the redevelopment project, and then they realize they have to talk to their financiers, and then they have to talk to their prospective end users, that's where things get challenging. And so,
could you briefly comment on how your work was utilized in making the fundamental decision not to demolish, but to redevelop? Sure. You described the situation.
Yeah, so I think Roberto would highlight that a little bit as well. Yeah. But it turned out that from the LSP perspective, like I typically care more about soil and groundwater contamination. Those issues here were truly minor. Like those were not a driver that would say to someone, this building is not reusable. The more significant challenges had the lead block in the flooring was, I'll say, a hidden cost. Like that was a cost that in the middle of this construction planning process, that became an issue. And like if you do an environmental site assessment, we can say here's what was a use in this facility, but you wouldn't necessarily recommend sampling of that material until you knew you had to dispose of it as a demolition waste or a renovation waste. So I think in order to make this project work, it was going to happen with the reuse of this building as opposed to wholesale demolition. And I think Roberta will speak to that a little bit, because this was, I don't think it was ever considered to be a demolition project. I think there were
when it was done. It was actually considered at that point.
Yeah. I think the challenge was putting together all the financing mechanisms to make the project work, to get it to that end user in time for, I'll be a spoiler and say, in time for Quinsigamond Community College to start their school year. It was, how can we manage all these waste streams prior to that? If things had fallen through in that financing world, I think the transaction would have never gotten to either to the acquisition or to that far into the process. Because then the other way to handle it would have been to think of the buildings as being separate entities and then redevelop them each individually, as opposed to trying to go at it with a really big program to solve the whole big problem. And I'd be glad to talk about more environmental detail afterwards as well. But I think the most interesting part of this redevelopment project is the chain of ownership, the financing tools that were necessary, and the number of stakeholders involved that really kind of make this, my part of it is a typical brownfield issue. What WBDC did is a really cool development project with lots of moving parts that had to be juggled into place to make it work at once. So with that, I'll hand it off to Roberta, and I'll be glad to address questions as well.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Dave. Dave was certainly instrumental in getting us to where we were. And I think what was a key way to answer your question about, did the environmental lead us to a decision on demolition? The answer was no, because at the time, the newspaper was still inhabiting the building. So the reason why, after all of these issues that Dave laid out, the reason why we continued to go forward with the project is because we're a nonprofit developer. We're signed into existence through the legislature in 1965, and our job is to take risk, often lose money, create jobs, and expand the tax base in Worcester County. So this was a perfect project for us, and a project that no private developer would do, even from the outset. The New York Times had approached us in 2010 very quietly and said, we are consolidating operations. We're going from 135,000 square feet in the center of Worcester to 30,000 square feet. And as David mentioned, they had already moved out their printing operations, and through a series of ownership changes, a significant staff reduction had taken place. Given what we needed to know before we took the leap into ownership, we had to do some due diligence. But the paper wasn't ready to move the remaining employees at the time, so we had to do it in a very quiet way. So we went out and we did as much non-invasive historical data gathering as possible. There's a lot of stories associated with this project, and the funniest one is where we had one of our project managers out in the newspaper parking lot, pouring rain with a cute little pink umbrella, and she's keeping the ground dry so we can spray mark test hole sites, and a photographer walks up because she has the cutest umbrella ever, and the poor girl's standing there knowing that she can't get this in the paper because suddenly the cover is going to be blown that the newspaper is being moved and the building's being sold. She panicked all night. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I said, just pray for a significant event to happen. The next day, Whitey Bulger was found. Julie was on the top fold of the paper, and in the telegram, Whitey Bulger was below the fold. So she upstaged Whitey Bulger, but there was no mention that we were ever buying the property. It was just the girl with the pink umbrella. So there's every facet of this, both financing, community involvement, environmental, issues with the contractor, probably has a 2-hour story involved. What I've tried to do is just condense this all into a presentation that does show, to Dave's point, flexibility from a developer and how we managed to weave everything together given what we knew and then what we found out later, which was even worse than what Dave had suspected, because we found rooms, we found vaults, we found false ceilings, Our demolition and remediation bill was $3 million for this project. And if we had known that well after the choice to stop, we would have demolished the building, and we would have had plenty of justification. It was not historical. It was begun construction on the first building in the 1800s, but they had done so much work to the facade, which you can see in this photo here, that that it had really taken away any historical value of the property at all. So, as Dave mentioned, we did acquire all these buildings. It had the great value of being part of a 220-space parking lot. It was immediately adjacent to the Hanover Theater, which we were the developer of in 2008. And we felt a real public need to continue development in this area because unlike other cities that put in a 2,300-seat historic renovated theater, nothing else popped up in Worcester because of it. We didn't get a new restaurant. We didn't get a new store. So we really felt a responsibility to go back to that district and try. We knew that if the Telegram left the building in that state and no one moved in, the district was really just going to fail, and the theater would fail. And the theater itself was a $30 million project that was completed in 2008. As I said, in 2010, the New York Times approached us and asked us to get involved. So that's what the building looked like at the time. And the one condition we had to the New York Times after we went through our due diligence, they actually contributed some money for the ink issue that was in the basement, as well as the petroleum in the parking lot. The one thing we asked of them was, please stay in the city. We cannot have the Worcester Telegram and Gazette paper located in Millbury, Massachusetts. So they were probably one step ahead of us. They had already begun lease negotiations across the Common in 100 Front Street, and that's where they remain today with us. So I'll just take you through some of the funding mechanisms that we used. It was a very complicated transaction. We, as the WBDC, were a 501c4 entity, but we have a wholly owned subsidiary, which is a 501c3 that accepts grants. So when we knew we were going to purchase this property, we knew we had to take control of it and take title to it in the 501c3 because we had a series of grant strategies lined up that included environmental remediation and also included a HUD grant, as well as a grant from the EDA, the Economic Development Administration, through the Department of Commerce. All of those require funding to go to a nonprofit. So initially when we set out and we did an analysis of this, we did an envelope study. We did the environmental due diligence to the best of our ability. We thought it was about a $28 million project, again, 135,000 square feet. We were looking for, but did not have a single tenant user at the time, but we knew that given downtown Worcester and given what the market was at the time, we needed a significant entity to come in and take some space. So with that cost estimate, given what we were going to borrow as a strategy, WBDC was committing at that time $1.8 million as equity. The city contributed some of its revolving loan funds for environmental, and the New York Times contributed some funding for the cleanup as well. So the New York Times initially had put a price tag on the building of $1 million that they wanted for the sale. We offered $300,000 and said, you're welcome. And and they contributed $137,000 back to us for the cleanup. So we essentially bought parking spaces, and oh yeah, we've got this white elephant in the room of a building that we have to take care of as well. We, as things progressed and cost estimates came in from contractors, we ended up borrowing from 6 community banks, $13.7 million of senior debt on the project, and that's when we started looking at, that was really the cap that we could borrow. Because the appraisal had come in at the time of $14 million. So obviously we weren't meeting any loan-to-value ratios. We didn't have enough equity into the project, and that wasn't going to get our deal done with the construction estimates that we were facing. So we started to look into some new market tax credit financing at the time. Because the appraisal came in so low, and there wasn't enough equity in the deal, and in order to fill the gap on the value, WBDC contributed another $1.5 million to it. And then the building, although not eligible for historic grants to renovate it, was eligible for 10% old building credit. So we, in the end, were eligible for $2.5 million of historic tax credits, which we ended up bridging through some partners. PCI and U.S. Bank ended up bridging those tax credits for us so that we could have those funds. In a new market tax credit structure, everything goes in at the top in the beginning as a leveraged loan, and then comes out through one giant disbursement later than you ever wanted to think about. After, really far after you really needed the money. Absolutely.
What kind of cents on the dollar do you expect to get from your regular tax credit? 90 cents on the dollar or more?
Yep.
Or less?
So the question, just for the folks on the, so the question was the value of the tax credits. We actually, at the time when we sold our tax credits, we actually got $1.05. So we exceeded the typical value of 85 cents on the dollar. And I'm told it's there's some variability given the experience of the developer, the project, the time of construction, and the time when the credits will be available, because we were always so close to the end of our construction when we were seeking more credits. That was a very quick turnaround.
So you got more than 5?
We did.
Like, is that just because of your mission?
I think that's part of it. I think we just so happened to be lucky with the timing of it as well. We've done other projects where we did not get that, though I do know the Hanover Theater, when they did tax credits, did exceed $1 as well. So come to Worcester. Maybe it's Worcester. We had some federal money in the project, EDA and HUD, as I mentioned. EDA, we had sought a $2 million grant for fit out in the space, and this goes back to Dave's point about multiple entities. So EDA likes to give to a nonprofit, which was New Garden Park, which did take title to the property. If you do a new market tax credit structure, you have to form a for-profit entity. So we were trying to walk a very fine line in terms of timing as when the EDA money would come into the project and it would be eligible to New Garden Park, versus when the whole closing happened and the Qualic B had to take title at the closing. Unfortunately, we ended up having to form the for-profit in advance of the EDA money coming in. So you'll see in a later slide where I show you the structure. It created more complications because we then had to have New Garden Park as a as another tenant in the building, a master tenant actually, whereas we could have just been a tenant and not had sublet. But the good news is the money went in. It went into fit out, and I'll show you some of that space. The HUD money, even though it's another federal agency and the new market tax credits come from federal funds, we never could blend the two regulations together. So the HUD money was ended up being bridged by Mass Development, and that will soon be converted to permanent financing. But that would have been great, low cost. It was initially a grant. It had turned into a 1% loan from HUD. And then now we're working through some discussions with Mass Development to find a very comparable rate for that financing. We were able to generate about $16.5 million in tax credit equity through the new market tax credit funds. And then we had some construction cost overruns, so WBDC put in another $2.6 million. So again, no deal a private developer would do. Probably not a deal WBDC would do again soon. But what we recognized, and as we can show you from the next couple slides, is that it was important to the district. In the middle of all this, one of our community colleges, Quinsigamond Community College, had released an RFP for space, which we applied for. And they were looking for 75,000 square feet, and they wanted to be in December of 2014. So we applied for them as a tenant. We lost initially and protested, and ended up convincing them and having them come to our building. So they were the major tenant that was required to make all of this financing work. At the very top of all of this, you'll see that we also got some foundation funds for the remaining fit out which actually should be updated as of Friday. We've got another $300,000 for those funds. This is the new market tax credit structure, which
you all can read that.
you go right. That was intentional because if you read it, I had to explain it. But essentially, what it does is we started out, again on a small. When we thought the project was smaller and more manageable, we had 2 CDEs, we had some community banks. We were going to put some equity in, and we thought that conventional financing was really going to drive the process and get us to where we needed to be. The project ended up being $42 million, so we were a little off in our estimates. We had a lot of time delays. The QCC's initial desire to be in December of 14. They signed the lease in February of 14, and they were actually I'm sorry, they wanted to be in December of 13. They signed the lease in February of 13, and they were in the September of 14. So we had a lot of construction delays. Our first press release to announce EDA funding had to be held outside because we had an asbestos release in the building 1 month after we closed. It shut the whole building down for 6 weeks. It was a hugely critical time in terms of construction that we just we couldn't recover from. We're hoping we wanted to give the school 8 weeks of solid time to move in. They had furniture that they had special ordered, custom furniture, and they ended up just through a great partnership. They really ended up working with us, moving in all the programs they could. Space wasn't finished. We were working at night. Of the 75,000 square feet that they occupied, we had probably 50,000 square feet. So they phased some programs in. The rest of the space, this just gives you, a snapshot of the funds that I had mentioned. And, another issue is the good and the bad of it is when we were a nonprofit and we owned the building, we wouldn't have paid taxes. The school wouldn't have paid taxes. There would have been a few small sections of the building that were for-profit, like a cafe and an idea lab that would have paid taxes. But once we switched entities and we had to put it in a for-profit for the new market tax credit structure, we then were looking at probably $130,000 in taxes a year that we knew the rent structure just couldn't afford. So we had to go in for some tax increment financing to the city. The city was very, very good about it, understood the mission that we had, and granted us 100% TIF for the first 10 years and then full taxes after that. So we have a few more years that we can work on stabilizing the building. So this is what it looks like today. We did put somewhat of a new facade on. We recognize that if we had peeled back the concrete that they had put to cover this beautiful terracotta features, that we would essentially, there was nothing left. They had essentially shaved the building in order to put the concrete on. So we added some decorative pieces. We added behind that glass is a conference room on the 4th floor, and we spruced up the first floor storefronts. So our tenant mix is largely, oh, did I push that too quick? I guess I didn't like that slide. I'll tell you. Our tenant mix is largely QCC, 75,000 square feet. We also have, this is a picture of our for-profit tenants. So what we have in the space as well, what the EDA money funded was a, oh thank you, was a idea lab and accelerator space. So our goal, our ultimate goal, is to bring entrepreneurs, college students, graduate students downtown, start a business, start an idea, and then move out into the city. We will help facilitate some low-cost leases throughout the downtown so that we can begin to populate spaces in the downtown. So we're hoping to have a long-term effect with this building. Because of our idea lab, which is on the 1st floor and does a lot of programming and has a lot of entrepreneurs come in, we had a tenant from the suburbs, from Northborough, 1024, who was sort of a startup themselves. They're a digital software solution company. And they said, we want to be there. We want to be where these people with great ideas and a lot of energy are located. We want to employ them. We want to use them as interns. And we want to help them as well. They have a mission, even though they're a for-profit, their mission was that the more that they can help Worcester and the downtown succeed, the better off for them. So they came in. Their space was also funded with EDA funds. And you can see here they're a very high-tech organization. They have an open space work concept. They have a ping pong table. And they're just a great group to mentor our young people that are in the building. We also have about 11,000 square feet of shared cultural space that we're continuing to fundraise for. It's a black box theater concept that will have lectures, daytime lectures that will be used by the college, but also our idea center, comedy at night, music recitals at night, community theater, and that space should be open next year. And then we have our entrepreneurs that take up our fourth floor as well. We hope to have a cafe opened on the first floor in September. And then our latest tenant is called Snap Chef, who's very much already in Boston. I think it's in Jamaica Plain or Dorchester. And they're a staffing agency and a training agency. So they take folks that are looking for work and they'll teach them kitchen skills, and they'll do it right in our building. And then they place them to hospitals and universities that need short-term kitchen help for either a catering event or a certain event. And eventually, if that's a good fit, then they become long-term employees of that organization. So they'll be working out of our first floor on Federal Street. And we have about 10,000 square feet left that we're hoping QCC will bring its dental program down to. And right now we're short about $350,000 a year annually in cash flow in order to make the building break even. But that we're hoping that with the tenant mix that we have and the potential tenants that are coming in, that we'll be able to close that gap. We have about 5 more years in our new market tax credit structure before everything unwinds. Some debt is forgiven, and what we'll have to do is conventionally refinance, and we'll have to service the debt that's still on the property from the senior banks, which will be about $12.5 million. And then the equity that we have in, we'd like to get back out. So we'll have the opportunity at that time to either sell the building, get our money out and go do another project, or if we're cash flowing, we'll have the opportunity to stay in and continue to make improvements and then build off of that in the district. I think that's just a different front side of the facade. And that's it. Happy to take any questions.
Are you ready for questions?
Absolutely, certainly.
Who was the contractor who did the restoration and cleanup? A single contractor?
So I'm going to take the very short intro, and then Roberto will give the details. So the Worcester Business Development Corporation has some amazing in-house qualified staff. So Roberta has kind of, I'll say, senior project manager, but they have another gentleman named Bill Karkin, who's an engineer's engineer and became I would call the prime general contractor. WBDC then was or was it New Garden Park? One of the entities was the actual general contractor, and then could sub in different trades for different parts of the project. Part of that goes with spending the public funds. There's procurement requirements and how you're going to put certain things out to bid if you're going to exceed a certain dollar amount. And so by subbing out, I'll say, bite-sized portions of the project, they could get a few qualified bids without going through the time and energy of a full public bid for every single portion of it. So that was part of the strategy for WBDC, was to be the in-house general contractor. But specifically, I don't know the name of the renovation contractor.
So we started with Cardinal Construction as our contractor when we were awarded the HUD grant. It was required to switch. So we switched to Consigli Construction, who did the renovation, and that requirement was prevailing wage, essentially, and a union union-based contractor. They were signator to the carpenters. And we then we went on separate tracks because we were moving at such a fast pace. We hired Federal Environmental and F&D Trucking to do our demolition and remediation. The issue of the asbestos release came in when there was some confusion with what Consigli thought was their responsibility when they found an asbestos release versus what we knew the contract said for, stop, notify the owner, and we'll take it, overtake the process of remediation. So we had a number of contractors on site, but the ones that we started and ended with were Federal Environmental and F&D Trucking.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the asbestos release? It's just interesting to hear about
Sure.
how you handled
Sure.
how it came up and how you
Sure.
recovered.
Sure. As Dave mentioned, there were, we saw what we could see with demolition. I believe it was not the floor with the wood blocks, but it was a separate floor where they were cutting through to do a penetration for probably elevator or stairwell, new stairwell that went in. They found some paper. The paper was exposed, about 10 feet of the paper was exposed, and again, not following protocol. They called in their own hygienist who ended up testing the whole building, even though this was on one floor of one section of the building, and that hygienist declared the whole building contaminated with asbestos, shut the whole job down, and created, I would say we were shut down for 2 weeks until we had a series of decisions to make as to how to remediate that, and what we chose was this sort of a vacuuming wash down of every surface in 135,000 square feet, and then a retesting by that hygienist. And it turned out that I think as good a job as everyone was doing, again, moving so fast, there probably were fibers in various places of the building from various just contractors coming in and out and material being, pre-contained and then contained and taken out. So I think there were probably specific fibers in certain areas, but the whole building should not, have been. But we spent close to $200,000 in cleaning and wiping down the whole entire building, getting clean airs, and then getting the go-ahead through DEP to go back to work. And it was just at a critical time when, we had about 8 weeks left to get QCC in to start with their furniture, FF&E, and we just didn't make it. But again, I can't say enough about the partnerships. We couldn't have done this without the city. We couldn't have done it without, great environmental team. The contractor cooperated. He recognized that, there was a problem in communication, and as fast as everyone wanted to move, there are times when you just have to stop and get the right people in to figure out, before you start ringing the bell, what the situation is. So.
I have two questions. One is, and I apologize, I named them. Did you guys seek any Brownfield tax credits, or is that sort of site?
So there were Brownfield issues. There were a wide range of contaminants. It turns out that the building material issues were 90% of the environmental cost. I should repeat the question. The question was, were Brownfield's tax credits looked into? The actual MCP response action costs, like dealing with some petroleum and soil, were very small, and for the Brownfield's tax credits to come into play, it has to exceed a certain proportion of the assessed value of the property, and so that would not apply here. I'm going to estimate that the MCP and LSP cleanup actions were in the 40,000 range, probably even a little bit less than that, and for a property that was assessed at 1.4 million, had other stuff. So that tax credit was not a viable portion. But the city of Worcester had a revolving loan fund that contributed significant funds to the project, and there were some other EPA assessment funds through another grantee, the Central Mass Regional Planning Commission, that paid for some of the original due diligence. So EPA assessment and revolving loan funds contributed to the project, but it was not eligible for tax credits due to the good news here was that underground contamination was really minor compared to the in-building material issues. The thing I was going to highlight also, though, about having WBDC be their own general contractor and I'll say, working with good qualified firms was that when there were change orders, like things were identified, there were opportunities to have meetings and really have a how do we solve this problem kind of conversation, as opposed to in some other public bid scenarios, the contractor's like, oh, change order, just start breaking out the cash register going cha-ching, cha-ching. That wasn't the case here. It was, okay, let's solve these problems. Let's find a way to do it. The contractor needs to get paid to do the work, but it wasn't about trying to find a huge profit center, where it was really about problem solving. And I think that goes to how WBDC and Roberta and Bill Karkin managed those vendors. And part of it is saying, hey, we're doing this $40 million project. We're going to do other multi-million-dollar projects. And so they want to work with folks and have a good relationship with them, as opposed to just cycling through vendor after vendor like that. That doesn't usually pay off in the long run.
That's great.
My second question was beyond the asbestos issue. Did you have any indoor air problems? The idea of having a college tenant. I was involved in a nonprofit daycare center last year. We had indoor air problems that just took us forever to determine that they weren't the problem. But
so we'll be back next fall to talk about trichloroethylene with Julie. So the really good news here was that the types of contaminants in the building were not volatiles. So inks were present in a really big space, not a big relative square footage, like not a huge part of the 135,000 square feet. But the testing that was done for soil, gas, and indoor air did not find volatiles of any concern. So this building did not need to be retrofitted with like a sub-slab ventilation system or kind of a radon ventilation system. And the types of contaminants we found were non-volatile, a little bit of the low end, like heavier end petroleum and some metals, but really not something that raised a concern for indoor air. That was honestly a significant part of the planning process, was can we make this building safe for QCC? It's going to be a bunch of students. I think they have a strong nursing program. They kind of were looking at this, I'll say, target audience of end users, and that was an important consideration in whether the building could be reused. They had some volatile storage, but it was kind of for the wood shop. So your typical cabinet of solvents and things, but they did not have huge. Their big petroleum tanks were heavy oils used for heating this building in the early 1900s. So not volatile, not gasoline, not chlorinated solvents, which would be a driver.
My war story that follows what you were saying about the 60 Toyotas was working on this nonprofit preschool, and it turns out there was a plume that started a mile away, and it was just enough to kind of trip the indoor air quality sensors in the basement of our building, and we had to deal with that, and it took us forever. And it was because we were dealing with infants. So.
Were you surprised, given how old the building is, that there wasn't more? I mean, it seems across the streets, that there wasn't ink without that.
So I would say yes. Like the actual, so the petroleum contamination at Myrtle Street from this old gas station, which just showed up on historic Sanborn maps.
We were hoping that there was more because the New York Times was offering to pay for anything in ground, but no building materials. So we kept saying to Dave, test more.
Well,
test more.
So one interesting thing on the Myrtle Street side is the contamination was really deep. So the shallowest contamination we could find was deeper than 15 feet, which really made it not an issue. Like even if there's a future multi-deck parking garage, it's not going to come into play. And then there were some big above ground tanks in the basement of the building. They had kind of these concrete saddle structures, so you could just see that there was some cylindrical thing here that was roughly 10 feet in diameter. But because of the operations in that printing press, they had these incredibly heavy machines that needed to be really, really stable. The concrete floor in this place averaged 2 feet thick, and under some of the other big mechanicals that needed like heavy anchors, the slab was like 4 feet thick. And they had, in order to move these like 1-ton rolls of newsprint around, they had these kind of what I'll call little train carts, and they had runners, like a rail in the floor. This was an armored floor, like it was an unbelievably thick structure. So there really wasn't a lot of weakness. And so if they had a spill inside, first of all, they'd clean it quickly because it would be visible and it would get in the way of their operations. But this was an incredibly sound basement floor. Like it wasn't your average like old warehouse where you're worried that it's kind of crumbling. If we actually got in our way, we were trying to do drilling, and we can plan on, we actually went with a concrete coring device, saying we can go through 12 to 18 inches of concrete, and we'd get 18 inches down and not be through. Like, okay, well then we'll move over. And we spent we spent quite a bit of money coring holes just to be able to then get our soil samples.
On that score, it sounded like the New York Times took responsibility for releases to the ambient environment.
Yeah.
That is outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the end, how much money did the New York Times contribute to the cleanup or the transaction?
So I'll repeat the question and you can answer. So the question is how much was contributed by the New York Times Company to the end transaction? So
they contributed about $165,000 at the end. Yeah.
Well, and they accepted.
And they accepted, right, you could say they accepted, so their initial thought, it was $1 million what the property was worth. So you could say that they contributed the $700,000 that we negotiated down to, plus the $165,000.
The asking price was $1 million? Mm-hmm. Now, at that time of the transaction, when the site assessments had been done and the contamination was known, what was the appraised value of the property? I understand the asking price. What was the appraised value?
The appraised value, so it's a tough question to ask without some caveats about Worcester assessments, but it was definitely higher than $300,000. It was probably, I think as is, when we went in for the TIF, it was $2.5 million was the assessed value. Yep.
What do you think it is now?
So I don't know what the assessed value is. I think as improved is about 7, the assessed value, but the appraised value as completed, that was done in 2013, was $15.3 million. We just went out for another appraisal to try to get rid of some a mortgage insurance premium. We're hoping it comes in at 17.2. And given what's happened around us, and we like to think we were the catalyst, but I think we just rode the right wave. We think that 17.2 is reasonable. There's $200 million of development going in at City Square right across the common from us with new private developers, new hotel, 300 luxury residences, 2 new towers of office space. So we don't think 17.2 is unreasonable, but given what we spent on it, $42 million, we're in, it'll never be worth $42 million.
To make it worth that much.
We did.
The New York Times structured a transaction where it got away cheap, especially when you consider the avoided costs.
I think, but you have to think of them as being a typical property owner that used the materials that were available to them at the time of construction and renovation. So they didn't necessarily go and do anything wrong. Buildings of that age typically have asbestos and lead paint, and they were very admittedly saying, if we did something wrong in the environment, if we spilled something we didn't clean up, if we left a mess that will harm the environment and people in the future, we will take responsibility for that.
The second half of my sentence was, but they took an open-ended responsibility for the downside. In other words, whatever was found that had escaped to the ambient environment and triggered mass superfund or federal, they'd be responsible. They took responsibility.
You're welcome.
Have you seen now some more young people in the
Yes.
area? Are you seeing the hoped-for effect of having
Yep.
done this?
Yep, we have, and the city has stepped up, City of Worcester. They've just launched an urban revitalization plan, so all those property owners that aren't seeing that vision, they're saying you have to get on board. You can't leave your properties vacant, blighted, without any storefront retail. You have to get on board. You have to put some money in, or you have to sell them. And if you don't, then we'll take them, and we'll put them in the hands of a developer who will. So we have a lot of support in the city for the investment that we made, and we're hoping that that's the last piece to get those property owners on board or out of the way, so that we can have a vibrant theater district, which is really what our intent was when we started the theater in 2008.
There's quite a bit of multi-unit residential going up within blocks. It's become a good focal point for condo and apartment construction. Directly in front of City Hall, so just on the west side of the building, is the main downtown, I'll say, bus and transit stop. So for anyone that has bus access in Worcester, you don't have to drive to get here. It's very, very accessible, besides people who can walk as well.
Sounds like a win-win situation.
WBDC gets
Right.
their money back.
Don't talk to my director of finance.
It's at least a catalyst.
It is, yeah.
And a magnet for what you described. But of course, the magnets in Worcester work at a different strength and speed than elsewhere.
Yeah.
But starting with the saving of the train station back in the day, that was the origin.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah, Union Station is a great project.
Of,
Yeah.
Worcester.
Yep, and then the hospital district, the DCU Center, Convention Center gets built out. There's more projects happening there. I mean, that's honestly 3 blocks just north of the image that's on the screen right now.
DCU, yeah.
Pretty easy walking distance, and that's probably where more of the restaurants are popping up right now. In that
That's great.
area.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.